Okay, continuing on our discussion of ethics, I want to talk about animal research. A lot of research that psychologists do has to do with comparative research, comparing the behavior of animals with that of humans. There's a long history of this going back at least 150 years, but although doing work with animals is not quite all that common, it is certainly something which is known, and there are a variety of research centers where primates are studied. The most famous of which probably is the Yerkes Observatory, which is part of Emory University, where they have a very large primate research center. But there are a variety of them across the world, and a lot of these laboratories do very important work. One of the reasons why this is so important is that humans and chimpanzees share about 97% of our genes are identical. And so trying to understand the difference between chimpanzees and humans might provide a window into what makes us unique and also about genetic diversity. So it's a pretty important thing to study. Now, some psychologists use animal models. They can range from some people do work on fish, other people do work on rats. Cats have been used in history, all the way up to primates, non human primates such as chimpanzees. And it's a very controversial topic because emotions run high. There are some people that believe that there should be no research done on animals, and then others that believe that animals provide a really great insight into people's behavior. So it really runs the gamut. And in any work that's done with primates, the pain that's caused to animals must be offset by considerations of the overall benefit to mankind. Okay, so whereas using animals for product testing, such as testing mascara or something like that, that's really questionable because it's unclear how that benefits mankind. But the use of animals to research new treatments for multiple sclerosis, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, which is misspelled there, by the way, I'm sorry about that, that's more reasonable, and that gives a little bit of um, more rationale to the use of animals in these models. So, if you are a psychologist that does work with non human animals, typically you've been trained extensively on the welfare of these animals. And so, if you are someone who does work with mice, you have probably taken many courses on what's called husbandry, which is keeping animals alive, and probably have a good amount of training in the humane treatment of animals. Now, just like when we learned last time that there's an institutional review board for research with humans, there also is a animal review board that every university has, where they evaluate whether or not research that's done on animals is ethical. And this is at Rutgers up in New Brunswick, and any medical study that is using rats or rabbits or any other animal has to apply in order to see whether or not the project is ethically informed. And so that is an important aspect of this kind of study. Now, it's important to understand that most studies that have been done with animals involve very little or no pain to the animal. For instance, there are people out there that do work on rats that run through mazes. And in reality, the rat is very much just like a pet to them. Or there was another person I knew at the University of Michigan that did a study on dogs. And the research involved having her friends bring their dog over to her house and her having them run through some kind of a maze where they had to make a decision as to where to turn in order to get food. That kind of study is probably more common than any study that involves an operation or any kind of medical procedure that would cause pain. And in that sense, that kind of study really has very little potential for harm. The dog gets to go to someone's house for a little trip. It's not harmful. Now, however, some people do research that involves, for instance, single cell recordings of neurons in the brain where they have to put an electrode in the brain. And when they do stuff like that, the animal is typically anesthetized. Now, it's important to know that the brain doesn't have pain sensors, so putting a probe in the brain, it's not like the animal can feel that. But drilling a hole in the skull does, so they have to anesthetize the animal in order to make sure that the animal doesn't experience too much pain. But I would have to say that the vast majority, 95% of research that's done on animals involves absolutely no pain, and more involves, whether or not a dog understands that a hot dog cut in 3 pieces is the same as a hot dog that's not cut at all. That's what the research that the person at Michigan was doing. But there are animal rights activists out there that claim that researchers are guilty of something called speciesism. And the idea there is that it's wrong to treat animals differently from humans. It's very difficult for us to know the homologies between human cognition and animal cognition. We don't know if non-human animals have personalities, identities. It's very hard to be able to figure out that. That's what a lot of research is based on. Now, the problem really is that it's a very emotional topic. Some people, are strongly anti using animals in any kind of research and will protest and will, their emotions run high. And there's really no clear resolution because it's not as if animal testing is going to end anytime soon. It's part of research, and it will be part of research in the foreseeable future. Although there have been some changes. For instance, there has been an international panel recently that argued that we should no longer do testing of any kind on chimpanzees because they are too similar to humans. So any kind of testing that puts a chimpanzee in any kind of pain is not an ethical use of an animal. So that's an example of what recent developments in this issue have brought to bear. Now, finally, it's impossible to talk about this topic without getting into research fraud. I have to say that the vast majority of psychologists out there are honest, decent, ethical people who couldn't even dream of fabricating research or otherwise engaging in some kind of research fraud. And so what we're talking about really is a minority of psychologists, and a small minority at that. And it just has to do with the fact that the reward system is set up in such a way that, just like in other fields, such as banking or in politics, a lot of rewards go to those who cheat, those who get an unfair leg up against others. And I think that's something to keep in mind, is that, often it's the case that, the system is set up in such a way that it becomes hard to detect fraud. And that's why it's important to talk about it early in the course. Fraud can be defined in many ways, but it's kind of important to talk about it being either intentional or accidental. Intentional fraud involves making up data. So imagine that I did a study in which I never collected any data whatsoever, but I sat in my office late at night and I just put numbers in the spreadsheet in order to act as if I did. That's making up data. But another form of fraud is to eliminate data that's inconsistent with your hypothesis. So imagine that you are doing a study that shows that men are more aggressive than women. And what you find is that, women are equally aggressive than to men. What you might do is, eliminate some of the more extreme women so that the data looks like what you had predicted initially, simply by cutting a couple data points. That's also fraud. It's just as bad as making up data, but it's using real data but manipulating it. Massaging it is the word we like to use in order to prove a hypothesis. That's also fraud to cite articles that you haven't read. Imagine that you read something in passing and you think, oh, that would fit in a paper that I'm writing, and you just cite it without having read it. That's fraud as well. Making claims that are not supported by data, and so on. These are all acts of fraud, and All of them are things that you want to avoid in your career. But fraud can also be accidental and unconscious. So there have been cases where researchers may have explained instructions better to one group of subjects than to another group, or not being blind to experimental conditions, which is something we'll be talking about, blinding and double blinding. Blinding basically is that you as a researcher are blind, or you don't know what condition a research participant is in. So if you're doing a drug trial, you as the researcher don't know who gets the pill that has the medicine and who gets the placebo, which is just the sugar pill. And so when you're blind to that, you don't know which is which. But there are cases where people weren't blind, so they knew who got the drug and who didn't, and that affected their evaluation of how well the drug worked. So they were more willing to, say, ignore a high blood pressure signal or to ignore other symptoms or side effects because they weren't necessarily blind to who was taking the drug and who wasn't. And that's an important thing to try to avoid. Now, there have been many cases of fraud in psychology, but by far the one that is most recent and most severe is that of Diederik Stapel, who was a Dutch psychologist who was probably, if you were to rank him, was probably, if not the top 5, one of the top 10 social psychologists in the world. So this guy was a big deal. And over the course of a career lasting from the early 1990s until 2011, he published more than, say, 200 papers, which were fabulous in showing a variety of really cool kinds of social phenomenon. For instance, when you're in a neighborhood where it's a little bit unclean, or there's litter, people are more likely to engage in racial thinking. Or if there's a variety of studies that he did that were to show that environmental conditions really do affect people's thinking. And what happened over the course of time was that he would engage in collaborations with students and others where he would say that he was going to collect the data, or he had someone that would collect the data for him. But instead what he did is he went back to his office and he just created data, which is easy to do if you know how to manipulate an Excel spreadsheet. It's very easy to come up with distributions and data. And what he did is he just made up data. And to conform or to be in line with the hypothesis. He did this for his students. He did this with other collaborators. And so it turned out in the end that there were 55 papers that he wrote where it was clear that he fabricated the data. Now, his life kind of unraveled as more and more psychologists became suspicious about inconsistencies in the data sets that he was producing. That sometimes two tables looked a little bit too similar to each other, and so it ended up being that the administrator at his university came to his house one day, knocked on his door, and said, "Hey, are you fabricating your results?" And he finally broke down because this was stressing him so much because he was, doing so much to hide his fraud, that finally he just gave in and he admitted that he did it. He made up this data. But what he did in the process is he really kind of messed up the careers of all of his students that he worked with, all of the collaborators that he worked with. He really did harm. And it took many years for journals to scrub his papers from their journals. And, he lost his job at the university he worked at. He, now... it's unclear actually what he's up to today. He's no longer a psychologist, and he will never practice psychology again or teach again. But he really ruined his career simply by not being honest. And so the reason why this example is the one that I'm telling you about is that it's the one that, made the biggest splash. And again, it happened quite recently. It was only about a half decade ago where this came out. And again, me and my colleagues that do work in areas that were similar to this, we were dumbfounded. I remember my jaw hitting the floor because I couldn't believe that his studies were fabricated. But it makes you realize that even people who are at the top of their field can sometimes fall victim to the temptation to fabricate results. So I want you to look carefully at this man, and you do not want to be this person. This is a photograph of him. He was featured in the New York Times Magazine as in a story about him being fraudulent. And that's not something that you really want to show your, family or your girlfriend or your boyfriend. Is the photograph taken of you in a story that is about what a fraud you are. So in any case, you don't want to be Diederik Stapel, and you don't have to be. You can be honest. So at the end of the day, fraud harms all of us, whether we're psychologists or not. Okay, it undermines science as an endeavor because people begin questioning whether or not the psychology and science is valid or if it's just fabricated by people wanting to make money. It threatens funding and confidence of the public. In the year after the Staple affair occurred, the U.S. Congress, cut funding to experiments like his by 68%. And I can't imagine it had nothing to do with that. It wastes time and resources of others. People who tried replicating his findings, and they were finding that the research they were doing did not replicate what he had reported. That's a waste of their time. And especially people that are young in their career, they don't have years to waste to trying to replicate findings that won't replicate because of on the basis of the fact that the study wasn't even done originally. Okay, so it's never worth it to, engage in any kind of research fraud. So in your career, I hope that don't you ever think of making up data for any of your research projects, because in the end of the day, the truth is far more beautiful than anything that you can fabricate late at night on your computer. So just remember that. I'm watching you, and I'm going to keep my eye open.